you noticed that a lot of the right-wingers all over alt media were not covering this war accurately. You noticed that they weren't giving respect to Ukraine, and obviously you being in Europe, you noticed that, and I actually noticed the same thing, so that's why we started.
Yeah, I mean, that is indeed how I started out because, I was pretty active in like keeping Europe, let's say. And yeah, what I noticed that when the Ukraine war started, I mean, all these people suddenly just completely turned their backs on Ukraine, were extremely pro-Kremlin. Like they all parrot the same nonsense narratives that, all these same Kremlin shills are doing. And, something is going on when everything is in sync. And it's all information that is super easy to debunk as well. So you got to ask yourself, are these people really that ignorant? In which case, they're not really worth listening to. They're not worth your time. Or are they on some kind of payroll?
Exactly. And, last year, which is around the same time, June last year, when I got in touch with Trevor Loudon and I thought about starting this channel, because I've interviewed him a number of times, I was, I spent most of my discussions with him asking about this guy and that guy because I just couldn't believe how many people were in on it. And now the list it's literally endless. Like I do have a list of guys. I might do a video like Brandon or Johnny Gattersdon. We'll be talking about him. But the list is just so endless of people who do this. So, what's been your reaction to the amount of people who are doing this 4 years later? And what really stood out was the fact that Trump was trying so heavily to make peace, and Putin just kept spitting in his face, bombing more children. Putin and his soldiers are capturing children who are surviving these bombing attacks. They're trafficking them across the border. They're putting them into indoctrination camps. We haven't seen this since Stalin and Hitler. First of all, it just hits you so hard when you see that. And I thought, well, surely all of these anti-war people are going to be talking about this. Abby Martin, Norman Finkelstein, Alex Jones, the list goes on. And not a single one of them talked about it. And that's when I realized, wow, the alternative media is so flawed. So what's been your reaction years later to just see more and more people fall for this?
Yeah, it's funny. The people you just mentioned, they fall into like different categories, right? Like Abby Martin is kind of like this anti-war type, together with people like Jackson Hinkle and stuff. And yeah, they complain about the Palestinian thing all day long, but not a word on Ukraine because, well, they claim that either it's the West's fault, it's the CIA who started the Maidan coup in Ukraine, it's NATO expansion. They always have a different excuse why the West or Ukraine is the aggressor. And I mean, what stood out to me 4 years later is that anti-war people are not anti-war. They are anti-West, and they're only anti-war when the West is involved. And even when a war happens that isn't started by the West, they somehow try to portray it as if it was. And yeah, when you talk about Alex Jones, I mean, that's like one of these supposed America First types who really are not America First. They are America only, really. I mean, they try to support all kinds of isolationism and stuff like that, which of course is to break up NATO, which is something that InfoWars has been promoting since the very founding of it, really. It's really something. And then there is the supposed pro-Western groups, which, I was quite involved in myself, and the pro-European groups who claim to care about, those of European descent, let's say, but not when Ukrainian children are being kidnapped or when innocent Ukrainians are being bombed. Like, but then, of course, they're saying, like, oh, no, it's just they're being liberated, guys. Like, these children aren't being kidnapped, they're being liberated, they're being saved from the war that the West started, of course. right? And then they go into Victoria Newland and all these things that have been debunked like years ago already, especially, you named Johnny Gatt. He was very active in this as well. And he really opened my eyes to this to a whole new level because, it's just, you have like guys like Mark Collette in England, and many Brits do this. They're constantly calling for the end of the United States. It just needs to collapse. Okay, so what's going to fill this power vacuum, right? They're saying, oh yeah, the best of the the white Americans will rise up and take control. No, it won't. I mean, it's pretty clear that if that happens, Europe is screwed because they lose their main ally in the West. And of course, Beijing and Moscow will see this as a massive opportunity to infiltrate the US at the very highest levels and fill that power vacuum for you. And now Nick Fuentes is saying the same thing, right? It just never ends. It's like you said, it's like every day the list gets longer.
One of the first things I wanted to ask you was because you live in Holland, right?
Yes, I am a Dutchman.
Yeah. So you're part of the EU, and the EU is terrible. May have been started with good intentions. Jeff Nyquist told me that they may not have meant for it to look the way it is now, but when it started, but it's terrible. It's socialist. I mean, they're trying to push digital ID. They were terrible on COVID, terrible on farmers. They're just terrible on everything. And we have it real bad in New Zealand. We had a horrible leader, one of the worst during COVID. But have you had conversations with people about, look, we know the EU is terrible. It's socialist. It's authoritarian. They're trying to be totalitarian, etc. But these guys to the east, Putin, are much worse.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing, right? I fully agree that the EU is far from perfect, far from it. But it's kind of like picking your poison here because do you really want the enemies of the East, having a much easier time infiltrating you? But also, if you look at what happened to Britain after Brexit, I mean, what a disaster. And it's funny because, this is another thing. All these anti immigration proponents in Europe tend to all be very pro Kremlin. They all have all these pro Kremlin talking points, and they will never call out the fact that Russia is actually very much also responsible, if not the most responsible entity for the refugee crises that happened, that allowed for all this mass immigration to happen in the first place. And of course, a lot of these people had like CPAC and stuff, and like I said, all these right wing political parties. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but the vast majority will just blame Brussels, for example. But when you then look at Nigel Farage and stuff, who was like sort of like somewhat right wing and promoting Brexit a lot, and he was on RT many times, and he clearly had some connections there. And Brexit was also promoted by Dugin in his geopolitical foundations of geopolitics book, of course. But when that happened, and the immigration became even worse. Like instead of immigration from like Eastern Europe, for example, they now get tons of immigration from India, Pakistan. It seems to be even worse, especially if you get someone like Keir Starmer involved, who actually showed up in Czechoslovakian spy files. He was at like some kind of communist summer camp or something. Like, yeah, I don't know. That's something I struggle with myself quite a lot, especially when people like Orban and of course Russia itself are heavily anti-EU because it at least keeps Europe somewhat together, but at the same time, it also creates this huge, powerful organization that has almost, well, not total control, but does have a lot of influence on its members and can also be infiltrated or just be run by a bunch of morons, and things go very much sideways. So, yeah, I wish I had the perfect answer to this, but unfortunately, I do not.
when I started doing this, I started trying to get on these big X spaces to debate people. Like I was on JQ Radio, I would call into, I forget the name of it now. It was a waste of time because these people, like they're flat earthers, they're so dumb. They don't listen to reason at all. But it was hard for me to question at first because again, the EU, especially with people like Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, Pedro Sanchez, Keir Starmer, it's so bad it's hard to think of somebody worse. But when you think about it, it's actually quite an easy decision. Say, okay, we want to fix the problems we've got here. Again, we've got a lot of the same socialist problems in New Zealand. Mass migration has been used for as long as I've been alive. But yeah, an opposing side invading to take over, the only thing that's prevented it is American might. That's obviously worse. So it's you don't Brandon, he was the first guy I was listening to who really red pilled me on this. It doesn't mean that you like your government at all, but to have another side invade and take over, especially the way these people are, again, I try to tell people that as bad as we have it in the West, again with these hardcore socialists, they're not as bad as people who came from a communist background, and specifically Russia and China, because of how the Soviet Union helped Mao win in the Cold War. They've never experienced freedom. So again, we have it bad here in the West, but it's not difficult to see that these guys are a lot worse.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a good point is, we have the EU at the moment. It's just what it is, whether you like it or not. Clearly, our enemies want to dismantle it for their reasons. But, as much as people hate a lot of sides of democracy, we can use this in our favor. That is kind of the beauty of it on the other side of it. So the EU is fixable. And I think that's already kind of happening, to be honest, because they have now a new resolution. I think that happened today, actually, or yesterday, that makes immigration into the EU quite a bit more difficult. So, I think if we get the right people in it, which is a possibility due to us being able to create our own political parties and, fight our way up the political hierarchical ladder, and then we can actually make a change. If we are dominated by the Kremlin, which may very well happen if the EU falls, if NATO gets dismantled, which is something I'm very much worried about, to be honest, then there is no chance anymore. You're completely in the hands of these communist totalitarians that want to rule over you with an iron fist. And if you think immigration is bad now, I mean, there are more Muslims living in Russia than in the entirety of the EU combined, despite Russia having fewer people than the EU combined. This, if they get their will and get their power over us, the immigration is going to get far worse. So, I think the EU it definitely gives us a lot of trade benefits as well. We can travel to each other's countries without much border patrol. It's kind of convenient, of course. But yeah, I think it's fixable. So in that case, I would go with the EU in the end.
You've also got, right now, people like Maloney in Italy and Naroki in Poland, who is very based. Maloney, she's got her issues, but she's pretty damn good. And she's also, mostly because she's a woman and she's a calm person, even the left-wingers who, she does everything that they hate, they can't really criticize her too much. So, yeah, it's difficult. It's easy to think that there's no solution, but when you look at it, any system is fixable. And again, as bad as it is in the West, we do have, as flawed as the democracy is, I keep telling people this, if you look at it, it's not difficult to see which system is better or a lot worse, however you want to put it. Like Russia, again, because of their history, they've never experienced free elections, and Putin has just made it worse out of all of the Soviet guys. China, same thing, because Mao won after the Cold War, and Yeah, as flawed as democracy is, it's a lot better. And I do want to ask you about some of these. On my list, I've put them under the category of anarchist alt media. Like these are the guys who are apolitical and they don't really tell you to vote this way or that way. They just say, look, the whole system's rigged, etc. Red Eyes TV, Carrie Wedler, Whitney Webb, David Icke, obviously he's the most prolific here. James Corbett, and also The Last American Vagabond. Because I don't want to do the guilt by association and call everybody a shit. Like that doesn't help us at all. But I've noticed with these guys, they are either apathetic towards Russia, like when you bring up Russia's crimes, I mean, again, with the children, which I do because nobody should be able uh, to argue against that. They either they either don't care, like they are more passionate about Trump starting a war with Iran. Well, we may get onto that because I've been interviewing Iranians over the last week. They're not as consistent, and some of them will go out of their way to defend Russia. Like the last American vagabond, Johnny Gatt actually put this in his video, Putin's Marxism. Some of his old tweets are very passionate defending Russia, which doesn't make any sense. I confronted him once on Twitter during the shootings, anti-ICE movements, and I said to him, look, you can blame ICE for being whatever, but one of the major problems is that these Marxist groups are being supported openly by Russia and China, and here's proof, and he just blocked me within seconds. Whitney Webb, I don't think I've ever heard her talk about Russia and China. David Icke, again, being the worst. I mean, what are your thoughts on those? Oh, Carrie Wedler, she's like a libertarian, anarchist-minded person, and all she does is go at the West all the time. Like she's like an anarchist who wants to dismantle the military, thinking that will solve all the problems in the world because there's no problems besides NATO. What are your thoughts on any of those people who you followed, and why do you think they have the view that they do?
That's a good question. So you talked about Whitney Webb. Well, she worked for Mint Press News, and she still is a contributor there. In which case, even if she wanted to criticize the Kremlin, she wouldn't be able to. I mean, also, her entire shtick is to basically just focus on Mossad's involvement in certain things and completely redirect the conversation from, hey, there might be some Russian intelligence involvement here, to only like, it's all the Mossad's fault. And that's something that I really noticed with her because I have read her books actually, like volume 1 and 2 of One Nation Under Blackmail, which is the Epstein book basically that she has. And she does mention the KGB a little bit, but more like in the past sense, right? So it's mostly about Maxwell's connections to the KGB at the time, which is something that these people always do because they want to go along with the narrative that the KGB was reformed and at the same time still be able to say to people like, hey, look, I talk about Russia in my book, therefore I'm not taking sides. But that's exactly what she did. Someone confronted her on X. She was like, oh yeah, just go to page whatever it was, and you'll see that I talk about the KGB. But does she mention the FSB or Russia, post-Soviet Union in general? Not once. And, well, only to talk about George Soros, which is very typical. All these people, they always talk about George Soros, and to demonize the Federal Reserve, actually, for injecting money into Russia after the supposed collapse of the Soviet Union, which led to Russia, she said, teetering on the brink of crisis by 98, which is also rather typical. But at the same time, she mentions the CIA like hundreds of times. And she actually on X, she blames Maidan on the CIA as well, which is also very typical of someone who is, behind the scenes aligned with the Kremlin. And she mentions the FBI a few hundred times and Mossad like 50 times, which, she also discusses Mogilevich, but only really discusses his activities during the Soviet era with Maxwell, who lobbied to get him and his associates Israeli passports, which allowed him easier access to US institutions. So again, focusing on the Israeli aspect, but not on the Russian aspect. And that's something that I see all these people do. And I think Yeah, I don't know too much about Last American Vagabond, but I do remember him doing the exact same thing, right? Always redirecting the conversation to Israel. And well, Red Eyes does the same thing. And, he also talks about all this immigration into Europe, of course. And then I actually asked him on X as well, like, yeah, when are you going to talk about the Russian angle of this? Because, all these Russian sailors that are being arrested and Lukashenko pushing all these immigrants over the border of Poland. And Russia has been doing this to Finland for decades now, slowly pushing people into their country to create all kinds of, chaos within the country. And these Russian sailors that I mentioned, they were arrested for actually transporting migrants into Europe. And there's also like a few Africans who actually talk about this as well, how they are constantly being promised by Russia to get like a great life in Russia, right? So they get paid, they take them to Russia, and then they send them into Europe. Like this happens all the time. Like, why do these people never discuss this? But yeah, when it comes to those people who claim that, don't vote, there is no political solution, accelerationists do this very often too. Well, they just want you to basically give up, right? I mean, like we said earlier, we can start political parties. We do have that power. In the US, it's way more difficult to do this. I think in Europe, it's actually rather easy. And, if you really have the right angle and you come with these talking points with a lot of nuance, and that's the problem with all these anti-immigration parties in Europe at the moment. Like the AFD is probably the most notorious one, extremely pro-Kremlin. Elise Vidal, she used to live in China. She worked for the Bank of China. She has a PhD that she got in China, I believe. She speaks perfect Chinese. Like, what kind of German speaks perfect Chinese? Like, I know many Germans, none of them do. She's married to a Sri Lankan woman, right? I mean, is this really the traditionalist, anti, pro-European person you want in your government? And again, if you have a system like the Kremlin and she would get in power, you would never get rid of her anymore until she dies and gets replaced by one of her buddies who believes the exact same thing. So at least we can counteract that with I guess with our voices, right? Fighting the information war, which is way more effective than people think. Like, for example, the Russia is known to have spent more on the information war during the Vietnam War than on the actual war. That's how much they value it. And, as you clearly know as well, they are still spending a lot on this. And now X is infested with it.
Yeah, and again, going back to the interviews I've done with Iranians, one of the reasons that they're confident that as long as Trump keeps this up there and does the right things, that the government will fall is because the Ayatollahs rely so much on propaganda. And people can look at the interview I did the other day. This lady, she was again describing Nazi Germany level stuff, and basically that there's a limit to that. That if people see that it's not true, the propaganda they're putting out, then people will switch sides. And yeah, so what you just described, that's definitely possible. We'll get to that in a second, but yeah, what you said about Whitney Webb, I do know, I haven't read her books, but I do know just by listening to her, she's obviously very intelligent. But I heard her mention that. I heard her say Victoria Nuland, phone call, CIA. And the thing is, these things are debunkable within seconds. So maybe, I don't know what to make of her. But it's just when people keep doing it, and if people keep saying, well, the West is behind this, when it's the most obvious time in history of this war that none of this is true, because look at how Putin's been treating Trump this entire time. It's embarrassing. So yeah, what you just said about her, that's interesting. You mentioned the parties in Europe, and again, you're in Europe, so you're one of the better people to ask. When I first interviewed Trevor Loudon, and I went into I started off with all the dissident parties in the UK, not just Nigel Farage, but also Nick Griffin. David Icke used to be in a political party, but also I think David Icke has exposed himself as just as big of a fraud as Alex Jones. Oh yeah, Tommy Robinson. How all these guys repeat the same Russian propaganda points. He went into just what you mentioned, that Marine Le Pen has had her life ruined, but she took money from Russia. Same thing with the AFD; they took money from Russia. I've also seen here in Holland, Eva Vladenbroek. She's repeated similar Russian talking points. Kind of hasn't given any credit or any respect to Ukraine. And this is what I wanted to ask you. I can see two scenarios. I can see that maybe these people, they've been blackballed so heavily by the EU because it's socialist and it's left wing, so they may automatically think, well, these guys are treating us worse than Russia is, so maybe Russia's not that bad. But I can also see, and I think this is most likely scenario, and I want to get your thoughts on this, that Russia being a KGB government and Putin being a KGB guy are thinking, okay, these guys are getting blackballed. Let's give them some money. Let's offer it free of charge, and we'll convince them that we're the good guys. What do you think is the most likely scenario with the AFD, Marine Le Pen, all these guys in the UK, and yeah, Eva Vladenbroek?
Yeah, Eva Vlaardingbroek, that's quite the character. Yeah, I mean, she got most of her fame, well, first of all, because of her looks, and she was heavily opposed to the whole COVID thing, which almost everyone is, right? I mean, that was, well, at least everyone who is at least slightly informed of what the potential consequences could be of such a totalitarian response. But yeah, she goes to CPAC, Hungary, which, we can get into Hungary. I'm sure you're very aware of what an absolute hotbed of Russian intelligence that is, especially with Orban in power. But she was at CPAC and she was talking about, yeah, we want a sovereign Europe. And, where do we see everyone who's trying to work against this goal, basically, in Brussels? I'm like, are you serious? Like, we're being invaded right now as Europe as a whole by Russia. Why are you talking about Brussels? It's beyond me. And then in the same speech, she talks about how, the EU is nuts for funding Ukraine and stuff. And that's something that all these people do. There's also this guy in Cyprus, I always forget his name, but he worked his way into the EU Parliament, and he's doing the exact same thing, constantly saying like, oh yeah, we're just feeding the war, the meat grinder, right, is something they always say, even though who started this war in the first place? Should we really stop funding Ukraine and just have Russia completely demolish the country? Or if you really are so serious about stopping this quote-unquote meat grinder, as Tulsi Gabbard, she basically says the same thing, like, oh, we're just pouring money into this, we need to put an end to this war. Well, there's only two ways it ends. Ukraine loses or Ukraine wins. Now, how does Ukraine win? By arming it to the absolute teeth so they can actually have a chance to destroy the enemy that's also our enemy. This is extremely in our benefit if Ukraine would actually demolish Russia. Now, you also mentioned Tommy Robinson. Yeah, he's one of these figures who just blames everything on the Muslims, right? But then he will never tell you, like, why are there so many Muslims in Europe in the first place? Well, again, Russia actually plays a big role in this. Will he ever say anything like that? No, of course not. And the last American Vagabond, yeah, I've noticed that. I already noticed that quite a long time ago. Yeah, he's one of these anti-war types as well, I believe. And with Whitney Webb, it's funny because she does say that last week I had a conversation with Jeremy Roth Kushel, who is extremely knowledgeable. And she said in a tweet, like, oh yeah, Jeremy, he taught me a few things here and there about Russia. Okay, so why aren't you talking about it? Because Jeremy's like a walking encyclopedia of all the things that Russia is active in and has been in decades. So why are you completely silent about this?
You do wonder that these people, maybe they're told not to do it. I mean, again, the last American Vagabond, I've taken some of the tweets that Johnny Gap put in his video. I put it in another back when I had Brandon on. I put it in that video, and yeah, I think that guy's definitely paid off. Because, and I know Derek Bros. I'm not sure if you know him. He works for the Conscious Resistance, his own channel.
I do know him, yes.
Yeah. I actually had a conversation. Well, we went back and forth a bit on YouTube. I think he's genuine. I do respect him. Like, I don't. We're no better than these J Sperging schizos, and we'll get into them in a second. If we just say, "Oh, you're a shill, you're a shill," so that doesn't help us. But what I've noticed is that he actually has done some work with the Last American Vagabond and James Corbett as well. They're all very anti-war, but as you mentioned at the start, as Johnny Gaddis pointed out, a lot of these anti-war people are only anti-Western war. They don't give a crap about conflicts that are started by the other sides. Last American Vagabond, again, he blocked me after one tweet, and I mean, again, you mentioned Whitney Webb. It's just all these people. I don't know what the answer is, but the fact that they don't change their opinions at all, despite things clearly changing. Like, it was easy to blame everything on Biden because he was just dead on arrival. But with Trump, again, he's literally bent over backwards to try and give Putin what he wants, and the war still won't stop. And like I said, you look at the videos of Putin bombing cities miles away from the front lines. These are not difficult to find out. We can add in these anti-Israel folks, the Jeffrey Sachs, Norman Finkelstein, Aaron Mate, Abby Martin, Callan Malpin, Syrian Ho, etc., Bulgarian, Jake Shields. All these people do is cry about war this, war that, but you see what's happening to Ukraine, you see what's happening to the children, you see what's happening to the cities. The fact these people never talk about it, again, we'll move on, but I think the word sick is accurate to describe these people who don't talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I find even worse is not only not talking about it, but kind of giving it credence that Russia is like, that it's acceptable for them to do all this. That's to me far worse, even, which, a lot of them do, like we said earlier, like they always come with, oh, Victoria Nuland, NATO expansion, and you mentioned Jeffrey Sachs. Well, he was very influential in propping this narrative up with, all these libertarians like Scott Horton. He even wrote a book on this, called Provoked.
Yep.
And it's funny, I was at a British conference in London. It was the Traditional Britain Group, I believe it's called.
Mm-hmm.
And these people are so anti-American and anti-Ukraine as well, actually. But it's really something. Like, there was also this guy who wrote a book. Also, he was a German guy, completely blaming NATO, of course, for the war. So I asked him a question like, so what is this book about? He said, oh, yeah, I worked on it for like a year, and it's basically, it goes into everything that NATO has done to Russia. Like, oh. So it's about NATO expansion. And he said, yeah. I said, so why did they not really care when Finland joined NATO? He's like, they probably think everything at the right time. So I said, like, oh, so you're saying that they're going to invade Finland next? He said, I can't say. And then his manager kind of like got in between me and him for, just asking him a question. Like, these people know that they're full of it, really. And, you're talking about Syrian girl and stuff, although you call her Syrian hoe, but, she, yeah, I mean, she has been doing this for a long time as well. I mean, doesn't she live in Moscow now even? I'm pretty sure
I don't know.
at
I know
least she's there very regularly.
she's been there. Yes, she's interviewed Dugan. We'll get on some of that in a second. Yeah, the Syrian hoe thing. I got that from Brandon. But she's lived in Australia for many years, and yeah, she's just proven to be an outright Marxist.
Yeah, as many of them are. Like, wasn't what was her name? Abby Martin, that you talked about earlier. Didn't her husband also say that he is a Marxist-Leninist?
Well, when I mentioned to Trevor Loudon these anti-war veterans who were lied into war. People like Lucas Gage, Jesse Ventura being one of the oldest, maybe the oldest, and yeah, Mike Preisner and also Ken O'Keefe. You know him. He's the he's
Oh
the
yeah.
he's the Hitler tard. And but then Trevor told me that Mike Preisner is actually a leading member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So I didn't know that at the time. And yeah, he's one of the worst, because Johnny Gatt documented this. He was openly promote. I mean, I totally agree with you that people turning a blind eye is sick enough, but then people defending it consciously, that's unspeakably sick. And Mike Preisner, you know, I took his words very seriously because he was clearly very affected by what happened in Iraq. I mean, understandably, I don't blame him for that. But the but he went on Twitter, and Johnny Gatt documented this tweet by tweet. He was openly defending Russia invading Crimea, and we've talked about the crimes of what they're doing, the attitude. You've got Russian soldiers, you've got Russian senior citizens, old ladies saying what they want to do to these people. I'm not sure if you've seen the movie 21 Days in Mariupol.
I have not.
Oh, I've watched that. You should check it out. It's a fantastic film, just because they really document just how, again, sick, and yeah, I mean it's incredibly graphic. And Mike Preisner, again, this anti-war veteran, was promoting this, endorsing it, openly saying the Ukrainians should let Russia do whatever they want. So they become exactly what they've hated their entire lives, but because they become sick mouthpieces for the other side.
Yeah, exactly. And well, that goes back to basically your first question, right? Like, how did I get here? Well, that's how. Like, I saw all these people being complete hypocrites, and I decided to, well, call them out on it, really, and really show the world that, if you put all these people together, they're all saying basically the same things, even though it's all false. So why are they doing this, right? Ask yourself this, because it really is quite bizarre. And it's, the network is so humongous. Like, and yeah, they really have all these different factions, like the libertarians, who are also the anti-war types. They're kind of like intertwined. Then you have like the white nationalists, who honestly, I thought that's where I belonged for a while, but apparently not, because I actually do care about my people, and I see the Ukrainians as an extension of that. So why are you guys, constantly demonizing them for fighting back? Oh, it's because Zelensky is Jewish, or some bullshit excuse like this. You guys are really ridiculous. Like, I couldn't believe it when I first started to listen to these people talking about this.
I've noticed that there is an anti-white element when it comes to Ukraine, because these people who we've just been talking about, because with Palestine, it's easy to, of course, feel sympathy for the Palestinians, no doubt, but it's very easy to see that this is nowhere near as black and white as the left, or as the libertarian types, or as the uh, woke right, some people call it, whatever. As much as they say, like, after World War II in 48, it was many countries were created, not just Palestine and Israel, and it was offered. The Israelis didn't start that war, and after wars, after you lose a war, there are going to be some very brutal things. So that's not uncommon. And I asked Jeff Nyquist in our first discussion, did Yasser Arafat actually want peace? And he said no. He said that apparently, I have to go back and check out the timeline. This is in a short video. He said there was a time, I think before Bill Clinton tried Camp David with Ehud Barak. He said there was a chance for peace, and then Yasser Arafat launched the Antifadas. And then you find out that Yasser Arafat he came from Egypt, which became a tool of the Soviet Union. It's understandable, and the PLO came from Egypt as well. It's understandable that the Soviets would want to cause, like, everything that people blame the West for, causing disruption and funding both sides, like kind of like Ronald Reagan did with Iran and Iraq in 1980. It makes sense the Soviet Union would do this. So it's nowhere near as black and white as these people claim. But getting back to the anti-white element of Ukraine, I've noticed that you've got right-wingers doing what Marxists do, just saying openly, don't you care about the people? This is so evil. Like, they don't discuss the nuances at all. They just say evil, 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 evil. But you've got something far more deliberate with Ukraine and Russia. Like, Ukraine didn't launch an attack like Hamas did on October 7th. And it's a much bigger country, and it's all been targeted, incredibly brutal. We've discussed the crimes. And these people, first of all, they ignore it, or they defend it, which is extremely sick, and that you cannot change their opinions no matter what you show them. The people who have been fighting against the anti-white agenda for so many years, it's actually been built into them, well, we've got to care about these Palestinians, they're oppressed, but they don't say the same about Ukrainians, despite it being more blatant. Like, Azov didn't start this war like Hamas did, so what do you think about that?
Well, honestly, I think everything surrounding multipolarity, to put it blatant, is just purely anti-European, anti-American, everything that European civilization has built. That's what it is. And yeah, with the Ukraine thing, I mean, it's all these nationalists have been so brainwashed into hating their own country so much that they seem to think that the only alternative is somehow Russia or China, even. Like, for example, I was listening to someone who had a discussion with Mark Collette. And this guy, I said earlier, he says that he wants America to collapse. Now, Adam Green, who was talking to him, asked him, like, okay, so, if you really think that our countries are so bad and are like authoritarian and, we don't have free media, whatever, which, to be fair, is kind of true in England. But he asked, like, okay, so what about China? Do you think Russia and China, do you think they have free media, for example? He says, he purposefully ignores the Russian angle, by the way, and then he goes into China. He says, well, say what you want about the Chinese government, but at least their government is Chinese. At least their media is controlled by the Chinese. I don't see them replacing their Chinese population. I'm thinking to myself, are you serious? I mean, the Chinese government is way worse than anti-Chinese. They're anti-human, right? They don't give a damn about any human life, really. I mean, these people are really brutal. So, again, like, is this really something that these people genuinely believe? Because he was also at a conference as a speaker that was organized by, I believe it was by Kirill Dmitriev, and Dugin participated as well. And a lot of these, white nationalist type, they always seem to end up having some connection to Dugin, don't they?
Well, Khaled, he's flown out to Russia, so that I think explains it all. Now, I don't know enough about him to know whether or not he was. It's similar to the question I asked you about these dissident right-wing nationalist parties in Europe. Was he just blackballed so heavily, and Russia came in and gave him a lifeline, and he then thought, okay, great, this is great for me? Was it that? Was it that he's just dumb enough to believe it? I mean, I don't see how he could actually believe this. He's got to know that he's lying, because he's one of these other people who, again, Johnny Gatt documented, because he speaks with such conviction and such surety when these things are debunkable within 5 minutes. But there's guys like Jake Shields. He's really blown up lately, and of course, my channel being about combat sports, I've known him. I've had tons of respect for him back in the day, but he's terrible on this. He's one of the worst. Owen Schroyer, who works for who split from Alex Jones, but I've actually noticed lately he's just as bad as Alex Jones. He talks about immigration and everything, so kind of like from a nationalist, a white nationalist perspective. But he's awful. He covers for Russia all the time. He went. I'm not sure if you know this guy, Ryan Marta. Have you seen him?
I'm not aware of him specifically. No.
Okay. Ryan Marta, he's been very big covering the covering the trafficking of like the pedo problem in America, and he actually gave Trump a lot of credit because of how Trump cracked down on the border and how he solved tons of what Biden and Mayorkas were doing. So he's really good about that. But he and Owen Schroyer, they openly came out and defended once the Epstein files were released. They said, "See, this proves Russia is not to blame." Ann Coulter, actually, I forgot to mention her. She's excellent on a lot of things, but similar problem. She went on trigonometry. I'm not sure if you saw this. She openly said, "Well, Putin was wrong to invade, but Ukraine should be part of Russia." It's disappointing to hear Ann Coulter say this. So Stefan Molyneux, he's been around a long time. Talked about immigration and for decades, for at least over a decade, and he's another guy who on Twitter openly defends Russia and says this is all NATO's fault. This is all NATO's fault. Yeah, there's tons of these guys that just David Duke being the worst. I asked Brandon this because he's been in the white nationalist sphere for years, and I asked him what goes through a lot of these people's minds. And even though I've always been anti-immigration, I never really got into the groups, the white nationalist groups. So I asked him about this, and he opened my eyes to it. A lot of these people are actually just sick in the head. And Collette, he comes across as a lot more rational, but nonetheless, a lot of the white nationalists he rolls with, like these people in Australia, like Joel Davis and Thomas Sewell, they're sick in the head, and they want to go down one in a blaze of glory. So they'll go out there, say Heil Hitler, and provoke people and say, "See, look how tough I am," when they're arrested. And they're just really demented.
Yeah, I saw Stefan Molyneux's post as well, actually. Yeah, that was not really surprising. Every time I see this, I'm like, oh, look, there's another one, right? I'm not even surprised anymore. But yeah, when it comes to David Duke, it's interesting you say that because I actually did quite a few clips on the guy because I saw him having an interview with someone, and he and Kevin McDonald are very similar figures, where, talking about the J Spergers, as I believe you call them. Well, they really take a different stance on why Putin is a hero. Basically, the entirety of the West is controlled by Jews. Well, the entire world, really. Let's say the entire world, except for Russia, right? Because he kicked out all the Jewish oligarchs. No, he kicked out 3 oligarchs who happened to be Jewish, who opposed him, so he got rid of him. Now there's tons of Jewish oligarchs left. So why are they still in the government? It's always Kuczynski, Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky. They always talk about these 3 and claim that, okay, you see, Putin is the savior of the white race or whatever. And also he kicked out the Rothschilds or whatever, even though the Rothschilds left on their own because of Western sanctions, actually, which is pretty funny. They actually did have a bank in Moscow or an office, but they left. Also, Nathaniel Rothschild is actually quite close with Oleg Deripaska, who is a major oligarch. They do all kinds of business with him. And he's also close with Beryl Lazar, who's the chief rabbi of Russia. Now, another interesting thing about David Duke, first of all, of course, that worldview of Putin being the anti-Jewish, anti-globalist hero, whatever, complete nonsense, right? I mean, he's not exactly a pro-white guy either. He has tons of migration, and one day he claims to be an Orthodox Christian, then he lights a menorah, the day after he kisses a Quran. He's a career KGB guy. He knows exactly how to appeal to certain people to eventually get what he wants. And David Duke does like 2 Jews that he mentioned. Well, guess what? One of them is David Sachs. Now, why do you think that is, right? And then there is Jill Stein, who is always in Moscow, who is also, has the same anti-war rhetoric as all these other anti-war types have. Like, oh, we just need world peace, kumbaya, blah, blah, blah. even though Russia is waging war in Ukraine, but we're just going to ignore that. And Jill Stein was also photographed at a dinner party, which was an RT anniversary with Putin himself and Michael Flynn. So, yeah, he was also at a conference which was organized by Dugin. And there was also people like, what's her name again? The leader of Code Pink, Medea Benjamin. She was there too,
Yep.
promoting LGBTQ in the West, of course, even though they put out all these headlines that, oh, Putin bans LGBTQ in Russia and stuff. They put that out like every month, like a repost of it.
Yeah, you see
But
that a lot.
they always recycle these old headlines. Another one was that you in Ukraine, if you are married to another man as a man, you now have a lawful marriage under the law, but that's only so that they can apply the law to you as well as a married couple, even though gay marriage is still illegal in Ukraine. But they're going to leave that out, of course, right? Because it doesn't really fit the narrative. And that headline was like 2 years ago, and I saw it pop up again like 2 weeks ago. Like really incredible. But yeah, these edge lords in Russia, or sorry, in Australia that you were talking about. Yeah, it's funny because they really are these Heil Hitler types because Hitler was supposedly like pro-white or something. No, he wasn't. He was extremely pro-German, or at least so he claims, and pro-Lebensraum for the Germans. So he was perfectly willing to screw over every other European country to give more Lebensraum to the Germans. Like my grandmother is from Rotterdam. She remembers very well getting bombed by the Germans, right? But of course, that was because the Dutch were siding with the Jews or whatever, right? That's probably the excuse they will come up with.
Because Hitler talked openly in Mein Kampf, but in these speeches everybody loves to go to, like his fanboys repeat them all the time. He talked openly. First of all, he withdrew from the League of Nations, and again, Neville Chamberlain and was an idiot to think, this we can negotiate with this guy. No, the League of Nations was started to avoid this, and he withdrew from it. He was talking openly. Pre World War One borders aren't enough. We deserve more living space, more living space. Again, everybody else be damned. He had a 4-year plan he gave to Goring, which was again it was very public. It's just can't believe people will believe this. But yeah, you mentioned the Jews and stuff. I noticed that Khodorkovsky was another one who Putin arrested. So people say, see, look who he's against. And it was simply because Khodorkovsky was against the war, and because it was hurting his business. And
The Chechen War, yes.
yeah, that one. So yeah, it's so obvious. But yeah, we'll get on to the J Spergers, because again, Brandon, he's the one who woke me up to this. That the fact that people say, and again, the list of people who do this is endless. It's all Jews, only Jews, no one but Jews, 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 Jews. Now, until I saw David Duke, I didn't realize that a lot of these people, one of the reasons they do this is because they want to avoid criticizing their own side. They don't want to criticize white people. Like when I saw that David Duke didn't want to bring up that a lot of Christians are open borders because Christianity is about giving, giving, giving. That was a big alarm bell for me. First of all, it's not true, and second, it's the exact same tactic the left does with white people. It's all white people, only white people. Like, these are the go-to examples I bring up in these debates until somebody moots me or kicks me off. First of all, you've got people like you mentioned George Soros. He's the guy everybody loves to talk about. He has open borders for everybody, including Israel. Brandon brought it up when I had him on. The highest group, they're open borders. They operate out of Israel, and they want immigrants in Israel like they want immigrants everywhere. And Zionists battle amongst themselves, like Laura Loomer and Ben Shapiro. I don't know where this has come from, but they've hated each other for like 10 years, and they're both hardcore Zionists. She's actually been openly critical of Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence, who are pretty hardcore Christian Zionists. I don't know if Pompeo's Christian, but Pence is. They're pretty hardcore Zionists themselves. She's critical of them. And there's just so many people who aren't Jewish who are open borders. The EU, there's hardly any Jews. I mean, it's a very big organization, but there's hardly any Jews there. They're open borders. Other examples, historical examples, people bring up the banks. You've got J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Bill Gates, others. These guys have never been Jewish. People talk about the war. Every war is a banker war. I'm sure you've heard that one many times, which takes away.
Absolutely.
Jake Shields does this a lot because his fans do. I say, why are you not talking about communism and the communists now? And they're not technically communists like they used to be, but they're descendants of Mao and Stalin, Putin and Xi. And they say, well, who created communism? Okay, Karl Marx. Karl Marx also openly said capitalism is evil and Jewish. He openly said that. Hitler adopted that. Friedrich Engels, he wasn't Jewish. And less than 7% of the Bolsheviks were Jewish. And then they say, oh, well, what about the top leadership? I don't have these names in front of me right now, and they're hard to remember. But if you take all of them, Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin, and these other names, about 50% of them are Jewish, 50% aren't. So it's really sick. It's actually a mental illness to constantly say, all Jews, only Jews, nobody but Jews. Those are just the examples I go to because I haven't researched it as much as you and Brandon have, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very tough issue to tackle because, because of these people, it really delegitimizes any actual critique that you may have of, Israel, for example. But then again, within Israel, like you mentioned, is also extremely complex. It's not like Israel is like one united front, just like all Jews are or whatever, right? I mean, you have now the Likud party in power, but that hasn't always been the case either, right? These things constantly change. It really isn't that simple. But I think that's also kind of why this attracts people, because a lot of world problems and geopolitics is so complex that it just oversimplifying it makes it just a lot easier for some people to put a finger on it. For some, it's like, oh, okay, well, it's just the Jews. I'm done. I'm going back to sleep, right? I mean, it's really, that really just does not work. It completely oversimplifies things. And also, like you said, a lot of people are not Jews that have been involved in really horrible things. And, blaming it only on Jews really lets people off the hook. And, if, for example, what about the Chinese? Like, they are quite a big issue against the West. But, where are the Jews there? I mean, yeah, they talk about some minor group. I don't remember what their name is. There is like a tiny Jewish group that look Chinese and everything. But, they don't control the CCP, right? So they always look for, even with Stalin, for example, like because he was a bad guy, we're going to go through his history and prove that he was a Jew because he has to be, because he was evil, right? No, I mean, so what if he's not? Does that suddenly make him a good guy? Like, to me, it's really kind of silly. And you mentioned all these wealthy families. I mean, what about the DuPont family or the Guinness family, right? They have tons of money. They're not Jewish. And yeah, you talked about the communists. Yeah, that's always interesting. Like, I think this is one of the key things that people really need to understand is that, the Cold War is over rhetoric is extremely dangerous, because that's why a lot of people now think that Russia's reformed, the KGB is gone. No, it's not gone. It just branched out into two different entities, the FSB and the SVR. The SVR being more like the international intelligence, let's say, foreign intelligence, while the FSB is more domestic. But nothing has changed. Like, instead of the state controlling everything, he just, he privatized the industry by giving all the industry to his friends. So now you have a bunch of buddies of the most powerful man in Russia who control everything still. The average Russian has absolutely nothing. There are tons and tons of extremely wealthy billionaires now running the entire country still. I mean, how is that any different than what the CCP is doing exactly?
Brandon's put it so perfectly. He said they have power disproportionate to their numbers, clearly, but it's ridiculous to say they run everything. It's only them. I mean, as Brandon said when he had Adam Green on, that they these people, they act like everybody else is like retarded, that they can't, nobody else can do anything. It's only Jews. Like, you're empowering them first of all. Second, you've got, again, Jews who hate, like, they battle amongst themselves all the time. Like Netanyahu is extremely unpopular in Israel, and there's no group that's unified 100%, of course. And some of the most prominent anti-Israel people are Jews. Max Blumenthal, Norman Finkelstein, he's done this his entire life, pretty much. Aaron Mate, and yeah, I'm sure there's a few others in there, but they're all Jewish. They all hate Israel. They all hate what it represents. They have the same people who hate their identity just as much as we do in the West with white people. Because first of all, a lot of the anti-Zionist Jews, they they want to completely dismantle the state of Israel. And I saw somebody, I forget which channel it was on, they asked one of these guys point blank, well, what about Hamas? And then he starts defending Hamas. Norman Finkelstein has defended Hamas for years. So in other words, the same people we have in the West who say we're evil because of, the British Empire, colonization, blah blah blah. They hate themselves. They have the same thing in Israel, and Avi Yemeni, he's a very prominent Zionist in Australia. I've really wanted to interview him for a while. He's interviewed some of these families who lost people on October 7th, and these people, I mean, I can understand them going mad because of what happened to them, but they've said openly, some of them, we don't trust Netanyahu. We trust Netanyahu less than we trust our enemy. Like, that's so. In other words, there's nothing really to the J thing other than what's out there in the open. They're a smaller group than a lot of others. They've got power disproportionate to their numbers, as Brandon puts it, but they fight amongst each other both at the common level and at the high end level just as much as everyone. So that's it as far as I'm concerned. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with that, actually. It's funny you mentioned Finkelstein because I remember he posted on X something like, "Comrades, the red flag of victory will prevail," or something. And he had this whole post, like super commie
Oh, wow.
slop. And, Avi Yemeni, you mentioned him. Yeah, he had a small debate with Thomas Sewell, actually. And, it was honestly, frankly, quite embarrassing. Like, these people really make, because he was pointing out, like, okay, so what about all the Europeans that Hitler killed, right? And he didn't really want to respond to that. I mean, that's, you know, these kinds of people, like, I agree with them somewhat. Like, okay, Australia needs to stay Australian. I completely agree. But this is not the right way of going about it, right? It's people tend to be like, nuance is really hard to find, right? I mean, how many people are like super left or super right? Because, well, a lot of it stems from, these lefties, they are self-hating, and all of these super right guys, they are also angry at the world and want to blame someone. And I've seen this personally. I've experienced this a lot with people. Like, these guys, I don't want to kind of like delegitimize his right-wing politics, but I think they are doing this for us as well, which is why I think they need to be called out for it. These people are extremely angry. They just hate other races and don't even know why, right? So why doesn't it come from a place of well, love, really? You want to protect what you have. You want to protect what your ancestors built. You're proud of it. It's completely normal, right? I mean, the Japanese are doing this. everyone should be doing this if you ask me. I'm all for that. But instead, we're going to talk about Hitler being, some kind of well, Jesus, really. Like, every time you criticize him, like with Martinez, he lost like 90% of his audience when he started doing that, which
Yeah.
is really insane to me. Yeah, you talked about the schisms within the Jewish communities. Well, that's really funny you mentioned that because David Duke's rhetoric about, the whole thing with Berezovsky, for example, and Kaczynski and Khodorkovsky, well, that actually proves that there is, especially Kaczynski, that there is a lot of schisms within Jewish communities because, if you look at Chabad, for example, in 98, they established the Federation of Jewish Communities of Russia, which, well, it was mostly Chabad run, and it was heavily funded by guys like Lev Leviev, Roman Abramovich, Mikhail Friedman, Peter Avon, German Khan, Moshe Kantor, Victor Vexelberg, you name it, right? I mean, yes, there's a lot of Russian Israeli billionaires, but the main Jewish organization at the time was the Russian Jewish Congress, which was led by Shayevich, but it was founded by Vladimir Kaczynski. Now, Kaczynski owned a TV channel called NTV and was rather critical of Putin and his whole, false flag apartment bombings in '99. So naturally, he was arrested for some nonsense embezzlement and fraud charge only hours after Beryl Lazar was elected as the new chief rabbi of Russia. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. So Kaczynski stepped down, now lives in exile, and the Russian Jewish Congress was, marginalized super quickly. And now Chabad basically runs the entire Jewish show in Russia. So, why was there such a conflict between these two kind of like Jewish groups if they always aligned on everything, right? So, David Duke's talking points, if you look further into what he's saying, you actually end up reaching this conclusion, which is pretty funny to me because it goes against everything that he believes in.
Yeah, exactly. And when you were on Brandon's show, I remember you mentioned that David Duke endorsed Jill Stein. Now, I saw him say that on Jake Shields' show, but then you mentioned the other pip, which I hadn't heard, that he said, well, Jill Stein's good for white people. Like, oh my God, like, Jill
Yeah,
Stein
he
is...
said that, even though she has a black liberation program and everything.
Jill Stein is a green, blue-haired, or purple-haired, whatever, communist who has never seen a Marxist group she doesn't love. And yeah, the fact that he said
Exactly.
that, sort of touch up on history a bit since we're talking about it. Like, I've really learned this speaking to Jeff Nyquist, Trevor, listening to Brandon as well. Again, he showed me this. Johnny Gatt actually used this words exactly. He said, a lot of the alternative media is conspiracy minded, when actually the truth is actually what's in the mainstream a lot of the time. Not all the time, of course, but like with history, I learned this when I was 12 again, so it was never, and this is actually the history that's accurate. The world was hoping Hitler and Stalin would kill each other because they hated both. Hitler preached about conquest. Even members of Chamberlain's party called him terrible because this is why he's condemned, because he didn't prepare the country for war, even though Hitler was talking about it openly for years, 4-year plan, etc. Like, this is something that people say. They say, well, why did the West side with the Soviet Union? Because Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and then Hitler declared war. There's no conspiracy there. And afterwards, NATO was designed to prevent Russia from expanding, because Russia expanded its entire history pre the World Wars. They got a foothold with China, backing Mao, and he won. So that's what's triggered a lot of the American bases in Asia, because it's the only thing that prevents them from expanding further. So, in other words, there's no conspiracy there, but the alternative media typically doesn't talk about that. Again, I remember when I first saw James Corbett years ago, like when I started following politics before he was banned, he was one of the biggest proponents saying every war is a banker war. And I see this nowadays, like I'm now debunking these conspiracies with Iran. It's like, do you really think, like Jeff, this is what I wanted to mention about Jeff Nyquist. I mentioned this to him, and he's a great guy, but he almost wanted to laugh. He said, "No, that's ridiculous. Bankers are middlemen. They don't own everything. Do you think Trump goes to bankers to ask for permission?" I said, "Well, obviously no." He said, "But this is what people
I
believe."
remember
Yeah.
seeing that clip on your channel, actually. Yeah.
Right, right. So there's no, again, using the Johnny Gat line, there doesn't have to be a conspiracy around every freaking corner. Like, so what are your thoughts on that? And then we'll move on.
Well, yeah, again, there's a lot of nuance there to be had, right? Like, for example, if the mainstream media was always correct, they would also talk a lot more about, for example, first of all, during COVID, I don't think they were correct all the time at all, for example. Or, you know, the media still seems to kind of like promote this narrative that the KGB is somewhat gone and stuff. Although that does seem to be making a comeback now that this aggression has been piling up a lot. And, I've seen some quotes coming out of the whole Putin thing, saying that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So, yeah, I think it is true that just because CNN says that that the grass is green or the sky is blue, that it's the other way around, right? You have to be very careful with that. Just like when even Alexander Dugin says that the sky is blue, that doesn't mean that it's green, right? So it's really hard to always be alert and always be learning more and more in order to get an accurate view of things. Because, yeah, like you said, not everything is a conspiracy, but I think some things kind of are being done in secret, and I think not many people know about it.
As soon as you say that, not everything's a conspiracy, people call you like a mainstream shill. People have called me a libtard, people have called me a Zionist. I'm sure you've been called that a lot. We'll move on now. One of the points I wanted to bring up is sort of like the mainstream alternative conservative media. I know that's a bit of a oxymoron, but people like Patrick Bet-David, people like Liz Wheeler, Megyn Kelly was actually pretty good on this. Like, some of these people were really good during COVID. But what's disappointing is that Ben Shapiro was one of the people who wasn't good on COVID. He believed the mainstream narrative, but his company did openly fight against Joe Biden's mandates and won. So give him credit there. One of the biggest disappointments is that people like Benny Johnson, people like Tim Pool, they don't talk about, well, they were both actually getting paid by Russia.
I was about to say, you mentioned two very obvious figures there.
Yeah, but the thing is, they don't, now that they've been exposed and for taking Russian money, they don't talk about the Russians at all, even though they're not taking money anymore. People like Megyn Kelly and Liz Wheeler, they both believe in the conspiracies pretty much. Like Liz Wheeler has had John Bolton on her show, so she's obviously not an isolationist, but she's talked about biolabs and Zelensky being, trying to drag this war out, etc. It's ridiculous. Megyn Kelly,
Typical.
yeah, she similar thing. She at first was pretty good. She talked about how a lot of the pro-Palestine movement support Hamas, but now she's starting to drift more to the left, and she's just proven to be a grifter. Like, she is intelligent, but mostly I don't trust her. Patrick Bet-David, this is really disappointing for me because he was really, really good during COVID. For the most part, I don't think Patrick Bet-David cares about truth. This guy's had Douglas McGregor on his show. He's never had one critical voice of Russia on his show. He's never platformed Jeff Nyquist or Trevor Loudon. Trevor was on Tim Pool once to debate Haz al-Din, but then he's never been on since. So I think Patrick Bet-David just wants to hear himself talk. I don't know if he cares about truth so much. So what are your thoughts on all of those guys?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's important that we do say one thing because, some critique that I have gotten, although very little, but, people can seem to think that we're just, gossiping or whatever, right? Talking trash about people for no reason. But that's really not the case. Like, I think it's very important that people understand what is real, what is not, what is the truth, what are lies, and who you can trust and who you cannot trust. And all these people you just mentioned, yeah, they say true things, but then they also say a lot of things that is complete nonsense. So this is, this kind of reminds me of this whole Vladislav Surkov thing, where he came from a theater background and he was in a documentary mentioned, Hypernormalization, which was actually a BBC documentary by Adam Curtis, and it's really good. I highly recommend people watching this. But he came from a theater background, and he was funding left wing extremists, right wing extremists, creating all kinds of conflicts between them, filming them, right, and putting them on the media. And then he told everyone that that is exactly what he's doing. So now no one knows what's real anymore, right? You're in a constant state of confusion. And I think that's what I see happening with all these different factions of media that all are aligned on the Ukrainian-Russia question, but then they have all kinds of different views on everything else to lure in different kinds of people, but still give them nonsensical reasons why they should be supportive of Russia. And, in regards to Shapiro, he was actually he has some pretty good takes on Ukraine as well. So, again, that doesn't mean that he's right on everything, but that's why, it's so hard. You cannot trust anyone, really. You gotta constantly be on your feet, constantly be extremely vigilant. And, when you said that he had Douglas McGregor on, Patrick Bet-David, you said?
Yeah, no, he's had Douglas McGregor on, and he's like Jackson Hinkle. These guys don't say anything intelligent. It's just pro-Russian crap because he's being paid by Russia. Yeah, so no, he's had Douglas McGregor on, but the fact that Patrick David will have anyone on, like that's one thing I really liked about him. But he doesn't platform any critical voices of Russia. He hasn't platformed Jeff Nyquist. He hasn't platformed Trevor Loudon. These guys have been doing this for longer than we've been alive, and that's really suspicious to me. That he'll platform anyone, but he won't platform critical voices of Russia.
Yeah, I see. I mean, for example, like you said, it's not always about guilty by association, but you can kind of see what kind of side they're taking while they're interviewing people, right? Like, there's this really big guy now, suddenly out of nowhere, Professor Young. I don't know if you've seen this guy.
I've seen him. I haven't looked too much into him, but I've seen Adam Green talk about him. I've seen some of the people who we all sort of do the same work. Restituta, James Falk, all break down just how he's a pro. He's basically like Kim Iverson. He's pro China, anti-American.
Yes, yeah, Kim Iverson. Yeah, she always talks about the Uyghurs, that being a hoax and stuff like that. But yeah, this Professor Young guy. Yeah, I talked with Adam Green about this guy as well, actually, and yeah, I mean, he has videos like why Putin is an Ubermensch, or the Ubermensch even, right? Which is really hilarious. He said that Dugin is like the greatest philosopher or something. But then you have channels like the Higher Side Chats, which is a channel I found recently. He had this guy on, but then he also has Jeremy Roth Kushel on, who I talked to last week. And I don't think he would have him on if he was fully hardcore like a Duganist kind of channel, right? So,
right.
But anyway, you also, going back to Douglas McGregor, yeah, he is the most obvious one. And speaking of, people associating with people, there's this one channel called Redacted, for example. Now, they almost exclusively have Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter and stuff on. Always talk about the biolabs you mentioned, just like Tulsi Gabbard does, by the way, just like RFK Jr. has done on Tucker Carlson's show, right? Like, what a mess. Well, yeah. So guess what Whitney Webb's first interview was after the Epstein files were released and after she had taken a bit of a break? Well, with Redacted, the same channel that constantly platforms Douglas McGregor, kisses his ass, right? And Michael Flynn also said that Douglas McGregor has one of the best, did one of the best interviews with Tucker Carlson. He said this is one of the best Ukraine analyses I've seen so far, and I'm like, are you serious? This guy knows absolutely nothing. Well, well, he probably does, but he's, clearly on the side of Russia and spreads the most bullshit lies over and over and over.
Yeah.
And his son too, by the way, who was associated with guys like Vincent James and this girl called Blonde in the Belly of the Beast, I believe her name is. Also supposedly pro-American people, but since it's Judeo-America and Putin is somehow against the Jews, and he's perfectly fine. And of course, they also had Dugan on, and again, it's not about guilt by association. It's about not giving him a hard time, right? You talk to him, you're gonna confront him on his extremely anti-Western views. No, instead, you just let him prattle on for like 2 hours, and then you just let him leave.
Going back just very, very briefly to some of the names I mentioned earlier, people like Jimmy Dore, people like Kim Iverson, Patrick Bet-David actually, they've all platformed Whitney Webb. Derek Brose has been on Jimmy Dore's show. Well, he's been on both Jimmy Dore and Kim Iverson. Jimmy Dore had James Corbett on. He had Ryan Dawson. So some of these guys have been platformed now. Again, yeah, we don't want to play the guilt by association thing, but all of these guys, Webb, Corbett, Iverson, Dore, none of them are critical of Russia. It's about what Russia's been doing, because when I spoke to Brandon, I had found out mostly through Johnny Gat's work, but I also remember this when I was following politics. They hadn't done all of the censorship yet. That Russia today would have on many of the alternative media. They had Alex Jones on, who he's been, as you've talked about, he's been anti-NATO for years, but even with things that don't make sense. And he was doing all of this after Russia had invaded Georgia. And Russia had not only invaded Chechnya, but they carpet bombed that and put Kadyrov in. So, but what I also found out through Johnny Gat's videos is that RT had so many people promoting BLM, like mostly through people like Abby Martin, Mike Preisner, calling America evil, colonial. You've heard that one a lot. America's the start of all the wrong wars, all the wrongs in the world. 2014, they had so many old anti-war people on, like Martin, James Corbett, Ben Swan. He's another guy, Q-Tard. I debated him once, and he's sick. Ken O'Keefe, Lucas Gage, Ron Paul. This was around 2014 when Obama intervened in Syria, and they had all these people acting like Russia was a victim. America was trying to start a wider conflict, and Russia was just some innocent victim defending against the big bad evil West. Before that, they had been around the same time, 2014, the end of Obama's second term, they were promoting BLM. They had BLM activists on their show. Antifa has openly said, Russia's our friend. So they co-opted vast majority of the alternative media around that time. It was the exact same move that they did during the Cold War. Everything they promoted was anti-West. They promoted the anti-West narrative so much, and nobody called it out. None of the right-wingers in the alternative media said, hey, Russia's doing the exact same thing the Soviet Union did, which is just preach about how evil America is, to try and say to the world, hey, we're great, we'll save you from those evil Americans. Yeah, what are your thoughts on all of that operation? That was huge, and it's led to where we are now.
You mean like BLM specifically? Just the spread of wokeism is basically what you're alluding to, right?
Yeah. They promoted BLM, they promoted wokeism, and they were also promoting people who would say America's wrong for all the wars in the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the woke thing is always funny to me because people like Alexander Dugin, he always talks about this, right? Like the West is George Soros, it's wokeism, it's now Epstein, right? It's Satanism, it's Baal. Now with the whole Iran nonsense going on, with the have you seen that Epstein file that was not scanned in properly, so it said Baal account instead of bank account, and everyone, including Jake Shields, was on top of it, and people were trying to change their minds. You mentioned Adam Green. He was trying to tell people how ridiculous that is, but of course, no, they're just a bunch of satanic pedophiles, and that's basically the entirety of the West, right? That's what represents our liberal values and stuff like that. But yeah, with the BLM, Khamenei actually promoted this a lot on X as well at the time. I remember this. He was talking about, the anniversary of George Floyd and how racist America is. Even Putin said once that America is founded upon genocide, of course, with the Native Americans. They're always trying to inject this into our society, like we said earlier about the LGBTQ with Medea Benjamin, Code Pink, right? That's a pretty big organization. And so why is she always on RT, but why is LGBTQ not being promoted in Russia? And then they also had this supposedly, I don't know if it's true, to be honest. I don't care to look into it too much, but there was this supposed male boxer in the Olympics, and all these Russian alliance people were all over this, claiming how woke the Olympics is, how woke the West is. And then, of course, they had this really odd kind of intro in the Olympics as well with what they thought was the Last Supper, and they had like some kind of demon representing Jesus and stuff, which isn't true at all. It was like the Mount of Olympus kind of. There's a painting of the Mount of Olympus by a Dutch painter that was actually presented there. It had nothing to do with demonizing Christ or whatever, but they were all over this. And yeah, this is, I think, why so many conservatives and people on the right in general, they hate their own nations. It's because of the stroke of wokeism, but who is really behind that in the first place, right? Like, who is constantly doing this? I mean, it tends to come from the Eastern nations, and then, yeah, of course, a lot of leftists, they absorb it and now preach it as if it's their own ideas. I mean, complete useful idiots, as, guys like Bezmenov would say. But I think that has been extremely effective, this whole promotion of turning the left so far left that the right can not really pay attention to any foreign conflicts anymore because the domestic issues are so large, right? I completely agree with a lot of right wingers that, yeah, the wokeism and stuff, it is an issue. But we must not forget that, we also need to look at the geopolitical arena because in the long term, that's going to really backfire on us if we don't pay any attention to this. But people are always like, yeah, why would we get involved in Ukraine if we have so many problems on our own? Yeah, but who is creating all these problems in the first place? So yeah, I think the right has always been the target of the infiltration of the left. That's what I think, because the right wing actually cares about their nation, and I think they still do today, but I think they've been so misdirected that they don't really know how to navigate in this crazy media storm that's just all over the place.
Yeah, it's Operation Sig all over again. And, this guy's almost got 1 million subscribers. Jake from Rattlesnake TV, do you know him?
Yes, he analyzes debates and stuff, right?
He's one of these very typical anti-woke conservatives, and yeah, does a lot of very good in-depth analysis on debates and stuff, and where people are wrong, where the left is wrong. But what I found, he just came to my head because you mentioned the Christian thing. Now, I'm not Christian, I've never been, so that therefore a lot of Adam Green's focus never really resonated with me. But I've always liked that Adam Green's authentic, but what I found really concerning is that people like Jake, they first of all, he's never debated me on this, and I've tried to because he's a nice guy and he's in Australia, so we're kind of like neighbors. But he's had Jay Dyer on his show, who I've learned from Adam and Brandon that he's one of the biggest pushers of this Russia Christian nation crap, along with Alex Jones and Stu Peters and Ken O'Keefe. He's one of the worst, and unfortunately, he believes this, and it's like, Dude, there's so many videos out there. He's bombing children. He's bombing churches, for crying out loud, but these people don't mention it. Trevor mentioned it to me when I first spoke to him, that Elon Musk's dad was in Russia at a conference with George Galloway and Alex Jones and Julian Assange. So it's Elon Musk is very clearly... Brandon's described him as a guy who just flips, goes back and forth.
I have looked into Elon Musk quite a bit, so I have made quite a few clips about him. Yeah, Elon Musk's father was indeed in Russia. He is going there again. He was interviewed by Jackson Hinkle. Elon Musk props up all the accounts that are very much aligned with Kremlin talking points. He boosts, like I said earlier, videos like Jeffrey Sachs talking about NATO expansion. It gets 50 million views. Now 50 million people think that it's all NATO's fault that Russia invaded Ukraine, right? He always criticizes Zelensky. He never criticizes Putin. It's pretty obvious what's going on there. Yeah, you mentioned Christianity earlier as well. I think it's, I don't really get much into this, but, I do know Adam Green's work on it. And the thing about it to me is, if our enemies win, you're not going to be allowed to be a Christian. You're not going to be allowed to be a pagan, whatever you want to be. It's not going to happen, right? So how about we focus on that? But yeah, Jay Dyer is clearly pushing the Russian Orthodox Church, and he almost always goes into debates with what's called the tag argument, right? The transcendental argument for God. Basically, you have no foundation to stand on. You don't know, you cannot say what is true and what is not because you don't have the Orthodox Church on your side. And the Orthodox Church is the only real way to God because of apostolic succession is what they call it, right? So there's a direct line to Jesus, supposedly. And therefore, Orthodox, especially Russian Orthodox Christianity, is the true religion, even though it's completely run by the KGB, right? Kirill is heavily involved with the KGB. He's a billionaire, actually. And yeah, when he talked about Christians being being kind of like propagated into becoming anti-Ukraine by people like Candace Owens and stuff as well, they always talk about how Zelensky is banning the Orthodox Church or is locking up Orthodox priests, if that's what they're even called, I believe so. But they never tell you that it's actually very specifically Russian Orthodox churches that are being shut down and Russian Orthodox priests that are being imprisoned whenever they are being charged with, convicted with espionage, right? So that makes complete sense to me.
The Christianity thing, again, it's never been my angle because I've never been Christian, but I actually mentioned this to Trevor that the fact that you've got all of the biggest names in conservative media, Candace Owens, Alex Jones, Tucker Carlson, they all did this within a similar time frame where they all said we were wrong to drop bombs on the Japanese, to drop those nukes. We bombed like the Christian, the home of Christianity in Japan or whatever. Meanwhile,
yeah, that's why we did it, because we're anti-Christian.
Yes, and that's
so ridiculous.
Again, because I studied World War II, the mentality that inspired kamikaze warfare, that Emperor Hirohito bled into his people, that's the reason those bombs were dropped. Horrible, but tragic, but it's because they wouldn't surrender. Again, there's no conspiracy there, but yeah, that just proves that this is worse than I thought. The fact that they say, well, this proves we're anti-Christian, but that the West is anti-Christian. But Johnny Gatt did a similar... Well, Johnny Gatt's got so good at going into the details, but he pulled up that when Prigozhin went at Putin, you remember that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I didn't know this.
I was definitely rooting for him.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't following the conflict at the time, but I've seen this in Johnny Gatt's videos because they are the best. He said that the alternative media took that as an opportunity to say, see, because Prigozhin has some distant Jewish heritage, the Jews are against Putin. but they didn't say anything when Prigozhin was invading Ukraine, and Prigozhin was a piece of work, the crimes he pulled off. So they are very sneaky with these tactics. It's really something.
Yeah, Prigozhin is a very dangerous man.
Yeah.
And I think Putin messed with him a little bit too much. And, he also exposed that this whole, saving the Russian speaking population and stuff in Donbass was a complete lie.
Yeah, we went
Right? He
we went
also
in there
exposed
based on
that.
lies. He said it out of his
Yeah,
own
yeah, yeah.
mouth.
Yeah, I mean this whole Jewish thing again, right? They do the same with Ukraine. There's like there's a Jewish sort of like oblast in Ukraine somewhere, and people post videos of this all the time. You see, Ukraine is just like a Jewish country, or it's like Khazaria, right? And the Jews are Khazar, so the Jews in the West are waging war on Russia because of what exactly? I don't even know what they're trying to say. And frankly, I don't think they even understand what they believe exactly when it comes to the Khazar angle.
No, I don't think they do. Now, we'll go on to okay. When you were on Endeavour News, you did a really in depth piece talking about the Iranian Revolution. How Pahlavi, when he was on Patrick McDavid, he said that he saw he didn't see, but he heard that there were KGB guys involved. Now, I've gone into the Iranian Revolution with Iranians on my show and in private conversations. The original Shah, they believe his intentions were good, but first of all, he was an authoritarian, and he was ruthless when he needed to be, which made sense because I mean he was born very young into royalty, and
Oh
you've
yeah,
you're a
and it's yeah, especially his intelligence service was known to be quite ruthless. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
Kazakh, is that what it's called?
something like that. Yeah. So the
Yeah,
Iranians have said that I've spoken to and I've interviewed, they've all said that, but Iran was a middle ground during World War II because it's how the Allies saved the Soviet Union from collapsing so that they could fight the Nazis. So it makes sense he would be a ruthless leader when there were communists there from the very start, trying to have their way. So no one they haven't denied that, but they've also said that they believe his intentions were good, and because it's crazy how these circumstances all came together at the perfect time for the revolution, because even though the Shah dynasty developed Iran very considerably from the Age of Empires, he made some hasty decisions because he was dying. So
exactly. Yeah,
and those hasty decisions just happened to hurt the country, which gave an opportunity to the Ayatollahs to take advantage and say, see, we'll rebel against this guy. And it was linked to Marxists, it was linked to communists. The Soviets were very clearly involved. So, yeah, that's essentially what happened. Now, you've talked about how Mossad was possibly involved. Now, somebody did tweet to me that an interview with the Shah, he talked about the influence Israel had over America during the 70s. This is shortly before the revolution. And this guy was a Sperger. He just kept trying to draw everything to anti-Israel, so I didn't pay much attention. I can see some Mossad operatives getting the wrong idea, thinking, okay, maybe the Shah is going to be a little bit he might be too much of a problem for us. So maybe we can take advantage of the revolution and we can align with these guys, like playing both sides. One of the Iranians I spoke to did say that the Ayatollahs they haven't actually cooperated with Russia for years. Like, Russia would have more influence and control over the country if they could, but the Ayatollahs were pretty ruthless and said, no, we're not following you guys, we're following us. They just happen to have a common enemy in America.
yeah. So the Mossad claim I actually got from a book called Charlie Wilson's War, and there was a man who was a CIA officer. His name is Avrakotos, and he said that there was a lot of Mossad activity in Iran at the time. Yeah. Now it is possible, to be fair, that perhaps they were doing that to try to keep the Soviet mullahs in line. That is possible. But I do know as well that, the Israeli Iran relationship is so complex, really. Like, sometimes they work together because they have a common enemy in Iraq, for example. But now clearly they have a lot of opposition to each other. And, it's really hard to put your finger on what's really going on there. But yeah, I do think this Shah, even though his secret police, his secret service, was actually trained largely by Mossad as well. But I do think he did seem to have a bit of issues with the the direction that Israel was going in. Again, the Israeli angle of everything is rather complex because it constantly changes. I know, for example, that what was his name again? There was one prime minister in Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, who was actually assassinated at some point, I believe, but
Yeah, he
right
was.
before Netanyahu
Yeah, he was killed by
came
a.
in charge.
He was killed by a Netanyahu fan. We may touch up on that, but yeah, he was the one killed.
Yes. Yeah, so he actually called Iran their best, Israel's best friend. Now, of course, he was talking geopolitically, but that's because they did have a lot of enemies in common. So another thing about this, the Ayatollahs not really listening to Russia, I'm not sure if I buy that because according to RT, some people claim that they made a mistake or that they misspoke or whatever, but I'm not so sure. They talked about how Khamenei was actually, he studied at the Lumumba University of Friendship is what I always get this name wrong, but this university in Moscow where Mahmoud Abbas was trained as well, and they said that these were
Wow.
two of the most notable alumni. Now, this was, of course, according to Bezmenov, actually, he said that this is a KGB run school used to train all kinds of people to eventually send them abroad and become leaders, international leaders for their countries, and obviously still be aligned with the Soviets. So
Just actually on that note, because when Trevor first told me the PLO, which Abbas is a head of, was always a tool of the Soviets, the way I
yeah,
found this out was that Abbas came from Egypt. Also, so did Yasser Arafat, but Arafat lied and said he came from mandatory Palestine, which he didn't. But Abbas came from Egypt, which was a tool of the Soviets because of a decision Eisenhower made. I went into detail with Jeff Nyquist about this, and so that's when I found out. Yeah, he has been a tool of the Soviets. But interesting, what you were saying about Isaac Rabin because I didn't know that.
yeah. So, for example, also in the Iraq War or in Afghanistan, actually, I believe it was, there was they actually allowed Israel and the U.S. to use their airspace to just bomb the absolute living hell out of Iraq, right? So, yeah, I mean, they have a common enemy in Saddam, and of course, Iran was one of the people who was actually behind giving the U.S. false intel about the WMDs in Iran, and through a guy. Let me quickly look it up here because I do have it somewhere. His name was Ahmed Khalabi. So he was supposedly an Iraqi defector, claiming that Iraq was indeed working on WMDs, which was very convenient because there were a few people, quite a few people, especially internationally, who wanted to drag the U.S. into this war. And yeah, this guy came out, and eventually he was also convicted because he gave all kinds of all kinds of info to Iranian intelligence, apparently, which I believe was in 2004 or something. So yeah, that was pretty interesting. But yeah, then Netanyahu at a particular conference, he was like, "Hey Zarif, do you remember this?" And he showed like some wreck that they found in Afghanistan or Iraq. I honestly don't remember it exactly, but I do know that Iran was very supportive of all the wars after 9/11, pretty much, even Syria as well. They were very happy with the downfall of Gaddafi. They were very happy with the downfall of Saddam. They were quite happy with the war in Afghanistan. And yeah, I mean, it saved them a lot of trouble, didn't it?
Well, you just mentioned about the wars. I mean, again, as soon as I took off my, as soon as I stopped being so one dimensional on this anti war thing, I realized that you realize the entire world is complex, it's full of imperialists, and the reason, because a lot of these people, and such a stupid opinion, because it's so easily debunkable, they say, well, America's done the most. Yeah, because America's the biggest power in the world. But America's also been very restrained compared to empires of the past. But these countries would do more, Russia and China would, if America wasn't as strong, which is why we wanted to stay this strong. So, about them funding or them giving bad intelligence to America doesn't surprise me because, yeah, they wanted that war to happen. And one of the reasons I say to people this intervention with Iran was inevitable is not only have they chanted death to America the entirety of the Ayatollah's reign, they have been made stronger by all of these interventions. From a religious perspective, they had such a big problem with Gaddafi, and like the Ayatollahs when Saddam Hussein invaded them, Gaddafi threw children on the front line when he was at one of the wars with his African neighbors. I forget which one. So they benefited from that. The Iraq War again was so terrible because it just made Iran stronger. And then of course, we've got the Democrats who have always empowered them. Jimmy Carter, Biden, Obama being the worst with the nuclear deal. So, yeah, that's all very obvious. But as you were talking, I just looked this up and it said that, or suggests, and I'll look more into this. Rabin may have been trying a pragmatist sort of approach, but
Oh, yeah, of course.
which makes sense because I don't know if we'll touch up on Netanyahu, but all of the leaders, even Ariel Sharon pre-Netanyahu, have been more pragmatist than him. I think he's terrible. But then in the
You
late,
think Netanyahu is terrible?
I think so.
Oh, yeah. No, I completely agree.
Oh, he's terrible because, well, I say to people, look, it's just a shit show because we'll actually just finish on what I found out is that it was it was a few years after the revolution that they started Hezbollah, and so that was probably when. So Rabin may have tried to be pragmatic with Iran, but they ended up creating Hezbollah. And I've spoken to Iranians who have confirmed the Ayatollahs use Hezbollah as a bit of a trick. They give them tons of rockets to use against Israel, but Israel will respond to them. They won't respond. They won't try and bomb Iran until now. So it's a neat little trick they do. But yeah, with Netanyahu, he resigned when Ariel Sharon pulled out of Gaza. So that just shows how far right he is. But the way the country is right now, Netanyahu, of course, is going to be very anti-peace and all that. Plus, he's got the corruption charges. But Hamas has been that way his entire life. So I think that situation is just doomed to fail, unfortunately.
Yes, so yeah, Netanyahu is a very long story to me. Like, when we talk about Israel, like we said earlier, it is a very complex matter. And first of all, I'm not against Jews having a homeland personally. Like, it would be rather hypocritical of me to be against such a thing when I believe that those of European descent should have their respective homelands as well. But again, it is important to keep in mind that Israel isn't really a unified state, and their policies have changed quite a bit over the years, depending on who gets elected. But now with speaking of Netanyahu, I mean that really kind of goes back to Jabotinsky, which isn't all that surprising considering his father was Jabotinsky's personal secretary, and he even described himself as continuing Jabotinsky's principles. So he clearly adopted this idea of, the iron wall that he always spoke about, and, well, territorial maximalism, which is something the founder of Likud, Menachem Begin, also believed in, who was the leader of Irgun, and they had what some today call like Greater Israel as their logo, and they're quite notoriously known for bombing the King David Hotel and, the whole Deir Yassin massacre, killing quite a few innocent people. But, I find it quite reminiscent of Netanyahu's philosophy. He really is Israel first, which I guess is kind of good for him, but it really is by any means necessary, right? Including, well, quite frankly, I think screw over the United States if it benefits Israel more than it hurts Israel in the long run. So personally, currently, I don't really think that. I have a bit of an issue with, calling Israel an ally of the West myself, mainly because of Netanyahu. And, there is a lot more to it, but, I don't like the guy at all.
You said the same thing on Brandon's show that if Jews want a homeland, let him have it, and
Sure.
that's contested territory. And again, I'm not saying it's obviously history is not all roses, but the Israelis did not start the war in 48. They also didn't start the 67 war. So it's a very complex situation. But if you're allies of the West, be allies of the West, and they'll play both sides. It turns out. I mean, I asked Jeff Nyquist again. This is one of the first videos I did. Why does Netanyahu have such close ties to Russia and China? Because they've both propped up Iran, and they've, Netanyahu, no, excuse me, Putin, as per the Soviet history, were backing Bashar al-Assad. And I know Netanyahu didn't have a huge problem with Assad as in power, but I mean that was just a shit show from the start. The Syria case. First of all, a huge amount of conservative Jews in Israel happen to be ethnically Russian, and I noticed
Absolutely.
Johnny Gap pointed this out in one of his videos that Netanyahu was asked about supplying Ukraine after Russia invaded, and then he pulled some dumb trick where he pretended his earpiece stopped working, and
Yeah, yeah.
as like a typical politician. And because it's interesting how Netanyahu's been able to stay in power for so long, despite people. He's been facing protests since like 2019, and one of the reasons is because he's very effective at forming coalitions, and he plays to the ethnic Russian Jews in Israel. So it kind of makes sense it makes sense that he would pander to them, and these guys would be right wing because Russia's always been imperialist. So that does make sense. And also Naftali Bennett, he's the younger guy who's even more hawkish than Netanyahu. He talks about Russia's going to be our friends and all that. And I asked Jeff about this, and he just said, well, like every country, Israel creates allies with people who may not be aligned with them. But it's just like any country. And I asked him about Henry Kissinger, and he gave a lot more detail about this, but he said essentially, Kissinger set up a lot of relationships that had different effects on different people, and Israel being one of them.
Yeah, I mean, Kissinger was quite an interesting guy. I mean, the main problem I have with him is he moved a lot of the American manufacturing to China through all kinds of deals that he did. So I'm not really a big fan of him. He was also talking about how the center of gravity will move from the Atlantic to the Pacific, right? Basically admitting that he wants China to be like the superpower in the world. But yeah, I mean, yeah, like we said about Israel, it is a very like a sensitive but also very complex topic, which makes it really hard to have proper conversations with people about this. You know, either people are like over the top pro Israel no matter what it does, or the complete opposite. But to me, like even if we put aside like the Jonathan Pollard case, who Netanyahu was lobbying for constantly, and he received him back in Israel as some kind of national hero, even though he was a spy working against U.S. Interests. Then we have the USS Liberty incident, the constant unauthorized transfers of U.S. military tech to China, which they've been doing for decades and only seem to briefly stop doing so when they get caught. Then there's the APEC espionage scandal with Lawrence Franklin, the Lavon affair, the Wolfowitz scandal, who handed over classified documents to an APEC intermediary, who is also one of the main figures who dragged the US into the Iraq War, actually. And, there was also a lot of Netanyahu lobbying going on there, too. And, another thing about Netanyahu, because I think a lot of people who do see the whole Kremlin situation happening, but they are still somehow convinced that Netanyahu is like this super strong ally of the US.
He's not.
Now, I'm sure, sorry.
Oh, he's not because of again the double dealings you just mentioned. He was a big advocate of getting Jonathan Pollard out of jail, um, but also he's regardless of what his motives are, he's just interested in survival. And he, as a hardcore right winger, he sees a lot of threats. He sees the threats to Israel's survival, and this is what he lives for. So it's like, well, if we've got to be strong, we've got to be strong, and we'll start wars. And yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And but yeah, that's the thing, right? A lot of these people who are aware of these, of the Kremlin's tactics. So if Netanyahu is not like on, let's say, the wrong side of history here, in from our perspective, well, these people tend to also admit that Orban is bad news. Complete Kremlin stooge, of course, and Hungary is like a hotbed for Russian intelligence in Europe. And now it even came out that Orban's foreign minister admitted that he systematically informed Moscow what EU leaders talked about behind closed doors to Sergei Lavrov specifically, who I'm sure everyone knows. Now, Orban also promotes a multipolar world order. His whole election campaign was basically an anti-Ukraine campaign. I think you get the point, but who came out in support of Orban to get people to vote for him? Netanyahu, right? Like, that's which is really crazy to me. Like, isn't that almost like an admittance whose side he's on, really? And there's also this man who's known for helping both Orban and Netanyahu rise to power, who is George Birnbaum, who is a protege of none other than Arthur Finkelstein, and he is actually the guy who invented this entire anti-George Soros rhetoric. He used that to get Orban in power in the first place. And if that's not enough, I think we can also agree that CPAC Hungary is an extremely pro-Kremlin event, which we discussed earlier as well. But who was a speaker at CPAC Hungary this year? Netanyahu's son, right?
yeah.
Yair. Now, it really makes you question why that is. And I think you know where I'm going with this, because Yair himself actually said that most of his friends are Israelis who were born in Russia.
Yeah, he
The
did.
immigration from the Soviet Union was the most glorious immigration that took place there. So, he also said that Likud is a natural home for Israelis from the USSR. So this kind of goes back to my criticism of the Likud here, because when he talks about the most glorious immigration that took place here, he is talking about 1 million Soviet Jews emigrating to Israel through the 90s, which increased Israel's population by like 20%. And these weren't just ordinary people, right? These were highly educated people like doctors, engineers, scientists. So they rose quite quickly through the ranks of Israeli society. Now, the reason why this is, I think, very significant is that according to KGB defector Yuri Shvets, about 90% of them were compromised by Russian intelligence, which would make a lot of sense to me for them to do, because I'm sure the Chinese are nowadays doing something very similar with their emigres to the U.S., right? Just like Mossad does, they call those the Sayani, right? Like the Israeli emigres who are still loyal to Israel. And even before that, already, according to the Metrokin archive, there was continuous KGB infiltration going on. Politicians, military men, like Shin Bet security services, personnel, defense industries, employees, journalists, clerics, foreign diplomats, you name it, right? So the Soviets were also the first to recognize Israel as a state and even armed them during the War of Independence through Czechoslovakia. Although, to be fair, that was mostly to stick it to the Brits, I think. Kind of like the same reason why they armed Israel's enemies before that. But yeah, anyway, what I'm saying is, I think the relationship between Netanyahu and Putin is quite worrisome.
It's interesting because they've always supported Iran. Now, Iran actually hasn't been attacking Israel much, but they prop up Hezbollah, who has. But yeah, it's a very interesting situation. I can see. I think the Well, I think the obvious thing is that Putin, like all KGB guys, is just playing both sides. Like, he didn't lift a finger to help Bashar al-Assad when he fell. I mean, he was also pretty friendly to Saddam Hussein. I mean, Trevor mentioned something to me which I've never brought up because we've always run out of time, but I'm going to someday. He said to me the first time we spoke that he thinks they shipped the weapons out of Iraq to Russia just before the invasion. Now, I don't know if that means he's talking about nukes or what, but sounds like they may. If there was something there, and I believe him because Trevor's a very knowledgeable guy, that's very interesting. And Putin was shaking hands with Bush during the war on terror, but he was always, again, they had been propping up Iran from the start. When he was in Russia, spoke against the invasion, the Iraq war. He was propping up Gaddafi, but he didn't help him when Gaddafi fell. It didn't. Same thing with Maduro. Same thing with Castro. So, and with Castro, it goes back from the start because you can see pictures of Fidel Castro cozying up to Khrushchev. This is a point which I don't. To me, it's one of the most important points which most of the alternative media don't know, because when I first spoke to Jeff, I asked him, and this is a short video on my channel, I asked him why he was always talking about the KGB, because we've, certainly for the time I've been following the alt media, it's always been CIA, CIA, CIA. Whitney Webb, it's always the CIA, everybody. That's what they've always talked about, Alex Jones, David Icke. But I've heard Jeff and Trevor in interviews before I started speaking to them, they're always talking about the KGB. So I asked him, is the KGB stronger than the CIA? And what he said to me shocked me. He said after World War II, there were about 1 million people who worked for the KGB. He asked me what my thoughts were about the CIA, and I said 600,000, because I didn't want to believe the difference was that much. And he said, no, there were only 22,000 CIA members. So that just shows the considerable disparity that Russia's had from its inception in terms of special intelligence compared to America. And I think if anybody knew that, they would say, okay, we've of course got to be aware of CIA, of intelligence here in our countries that don't have our best interests at heart, but Russia is way worse.
Well, well, there is a bit of a caveat with that, though, because a lot of the people who are on the FSB payroll, they are, border patrol as well, for example, right? So they're not all like actual intelligence officers. However, I do think they are correct in the fact that the FSB plus SVR is the biggest and most experienced intelligence agency in the world. I mean, the Russians are basically the inventors of the Secret Service, right? It's starting with the Okrana, the Cheka, the Chekis, what is it called again? The Cheka, right? I believe.
Was this the original?
Yeah, the Cheka secret police. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And then it became the KGB, of course. And so, yeah, I do think they are the most experienced. They are definitely the largest, even though I think those numbers are a bit inflated because of, like I said, there's a lot of people who aren't necessarily intelligence officers that are also counted in that number. But that doesn't make it any less true that they are by far the biggest intelligence agency in the world. And then there's also this aspect where you said, like, hey, people always talk about the CIA, but, there's also people who only talk about Mossad. But, the way I see it is, why is it that people who complain about being deplatformed because they talk about Mossad in like the dumbest way possible, they think that that's why, they always talk about, yeah, if you want to know who rules over you, then you got to look at who you cannot criticize.
Yeah,
Well,
you hear that a lot.
Yeah, so quite frankly, I don't see opponents of the Mossad and CIA falling out of apartment buildings or crashing their private planes or getting poisoned out of nowhere or get hung in prison. I only see people who oppose the KGB or the FSB happen that too, right? So they are clearly the biggest, the most experienced, and by far the most ruthless.
By far. And you mentioned the amount of people who have fallen out of buildings. which is, I mean, it's like some James Bond stuff when you look into it, but it's real life. What they did with Navalny was just so, I mean, that should have been so obvious. Like, they poisoned the guy clearly. He was speaking, he was doing interviews with Western media saying, this is what's happening to me, but I want to fight for my country because we're losing our rights and it's all down to Putin and his boys. And then they poisoned him again. But what they did with the defector Alexander Litvinenko, like, Jeff Nyquist described that to me, and that's a real graphic scenario you go into it, just how long it took for him to die and what he looked like when he was on his deathbed. And yeah, the amount of people who have always been saying, look, these people are dangerous, they'll kill you, they'll hunt you down, etc. I mean, that happens in all of these totalitarian countries. Like, again, we've got it bad here in America. My heritage is British, so I hate what's happened to Britain. But again, there are some countries who, because they were on the wrong side of the Cold War, they experience less freedom than us. And these things are common. But with Russia, like you just said, Putin's been killing people. He's been throwing people out of buildings. What they did with Navalny and Litvinenko back in the day. I don't know if the reports were true that Xi Jinping had a confrontation with generals who felt that he was ruining the country. I mean, it's possible. We know Putin's dismissed generals quite repeatedly. The guy he's kept in place is Sergei Shoigu, who was like the least competent general. But the things that people complain about, you're going to get killed, you're going to get killed, you're going to get killed. Well, it actually happens in Russia, but these people don't talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. I actually do believe the whole story of Xi Jinping because
Interesting.
the only thing, the reason why is because the only thing that Xi Jinping can fear is his fellow elites. So if there's any indication of any fracturing, of any opposition to him, he kind of has to take control immediately because, the Chinese people are not going to rise up. They cannot. I mean, the Chinese honestly really have authoritarianism figured out because all their generals, they manage a bunch of the military, right? And they're all like getting paid really well. And of course, they rat out anyone who is of any threat to the Chinese state. And why would they themselves rise up against Xi Jinping or to the CCP in general when they live such great lives together with their families? And of course, they don't even have really a national army. It's the CCP's army, right? They really know what they're doing. I mean, it's always like this. Just look at Caesar, for example. I mean, who took him down? It was his own Senate, right? I mean, that's usually how it happens.
Yeah, and I don't have the name in front of me, but the most prolific army commander after World War II from the Soviets, I forget his name, but he was so popular that Stalin feared he was going to be a threat to his dynasty, so he didn't kill him. Huh?
I said, yeah, there you go. That's usually how it is, yeah.
Yeah, so he dismissed him, and yeah, that's interesting. What you just said about China, but yeah, it makes all the sense in the world. I mean, I guess we've been talking for 2.5 hours, man. It's been a great chat. I'd love to do this again. By the way, I'd love to have you on again.
Yeah, let's do it.
Looking ahead to the future, like for the reasons you just mentioned, again, these guys, there's no conspiracy, and you don't even have to do deep research to know this. Yeah, all one-man tyrannies have a limit because you can't keep everyone quiet forever. And again, in these interviews I've done with Iranians, I've heard some of the sickest things I've ever heard. But what they're standing for and what they're fighting for, it's all true. And people will do the same thing in Russia, but they get shut down quickly. So you can't one man, which is what these tyrannies are. They can't keep everyone down forever. So looking ahead to the future, Trevor's mentioned this to me. He says, look, all these people talk about the debt in America and the debt in the West, which is bad, but he keeps talking. He's told me about the economic problems Russia and China have. I mean, Putin, because if he retreats, if he pulls his troops back, he will be overthrown. There's no question about that. It will be bloody, but people will do that. He has run his economy into the ground for years, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And even though Trump's schizophrenic on a lot of things, cutting off Russia and China from Venezuela and Latin America as a whole, and soon to be Cuba, Iran, all the Iranians I've spoken to have said the regime will fall. It's just a matter of when. but they're going to keep fighting for as long as they can. This is all hurting them, and these countries, they can only hold on to power through desperate measures, like you just said. So looking ahead, I definitely, obviously, I'm very wary of this war because as if Putin, if Ukraine falls, then it's no question China will move into Taiwan. They'll threaten Japan, although Japan's new prime minister is is a big threat to them. But we'll be the last ones in New Zealand. And also with all this technocracy, Trump's got a lot of technocrats around him, very concerning. But personally, this is what I did to try and stay sane during COVID. They didn't succeed the way the leaders. You had a lot in the EU. We had one of the worst in New Zealand. They said this is permanent, lockdowns, vaccines, all permanent, and it wasn't. So definitely wary, definitely cautious, definitely wish things were different. But I guess I want to say that they're not as powerful as they are, and in the end, maybe democracy will win. What are your thoughts on that before we say goodbye?
Yeah, first of all, I think you're right about Putin being overthrown if he retreats now, because again, I think the only people who can really sort of like who are really a threat to these people who are in absolute power are the people that surround them. And I think the oligarchs are going to be very angry at him if this doesn't work out the way he promised it would. So let's see how that goes. The only danger I see in that, though, and this is a big issue, I think, is that if Putin goes down and is replaced by someone else, I think they will use that opportunity as yet another kind of perestroika deception. That's what I'm worried about.
Is it possible that a worse person could take over? Yes, it is, unfortunately.
Even more so, yes, but then at the same time also pretend again to be a friend of the West, right? Like, oh, this guy's like a new Gorbachev. He's going to be so kind to you guys, even though, clearly they're still going to have, like, in the background, build up their military and eventually just start all over again, right? Just to make the West lazy, basically, and think that, okay, we have no enemy anymore, so we can relax, even though they will still do their information war, they will still keep doing all the things they always did, but pretend as if, they changed, which is a very dangerous thing, I think. But yeah, also when you talked about China moving into Taiwan and stuff, yes, and I think also Russia will then move into either Moldova or the Baltics. My guess would be the Baltics, but we'll see how that goes. In terms of, a winning strategy, yeah, I think as long as we do have democracy, again, everyone has their issues with it, but it's only really a problem if you sit back and let it control you instead of you taking charge over it. So that's what we need to do. I think we need to keep fighting the information war, keep people actually informed, try to break through all these crazy media narratives that are all over the place that just confuse the absolute hell out of people where they have no idea what's even real anymore, keeping them in a constant state of confusion, a la Vladislav Surkov. And yeah, I think, there was this one guy, for example, he actually left the AFD because he said that, yeah, they're just a bunch of Russian shills, right? So he got
Wow.
sick of them. So I hope guys like this, who actually do have sense, who are actually pro-Europe, who want to keep Europe European as well, that, they start political parties, that we talk some sense into them with our, unfortunately, smaller media channels, but hey, you never know. We might be able to reach the right people and see where it goes. But yeah, I think, I don't think everything is doomed like a lot of people try to make you believe in the old media. So yeah, my advice is take charge over our own destiny.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, and a lot of the alternative media who said, like, it wasn't just Alex Jones and David Icke, it was a lot of them who said that they're going to bring in this technocratic state. I mean, they're always going to try that. But even Keith Woods has broken this down that the technology is not even as smart as they say. Like, they're not, like, Skynet's not here yet. But yeah, a lot of the people who end up saying, yeah, it's going to get really bad, they end up covering for Russia and China. But yeah, they can only succeed if we let them. And I do see a lot of changes that are positive. Like, I first of all, have you ever? I've seen you promote Trevor Loudon. Have you ever interviewed him? Because I can get you in touch with him.
Yeah, I might be interested in that actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
can.
I've promoted him a little bit on Adam Green's show because I think that an audience like that, they're so, I know they're very much into the Israeli angle and stuff, and I don't completely disagree with them, but I think a lot of it is a little overblown, which is why when I was on the show, I really tried to hammer down to them like, hey, look at Russia as well and at China. It's not just Israel, right? So please. Try to push the conversation further than just that, which, I'll give him credit. He's certainly willing to do so. And yeah, I thought he was that was a good audience to promote Trevor Lawton to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Trevor's been great when I've interviewed him a number of times, and I do like also with smaller channels like myself and you, and Brandon's been doing this for a long time, but also James Falk. I know you've seen the like fortnightly shows that James and I do. He's one of the best researchers. He's got a book coming
Yeah,
out
he does
soon.
great work. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I had a lecturer Glide on recently, Restituta, and yeah, I'm going to be trying to get in touch with more anti-communists. But yeah, I think we're making moves, and if these people were as powerful as they claim they were, they would have won a long time ago. And
Exactly.
yeah, well, thank you for coming on, man. Check out. Tell people to check out your websites, Western Alliance Resistance on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. I'd like to have you on again, man. And yeah, keep going and we'll be in touch. And yeah, thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to the next one.
For sure, man. Take care.